Well, good afternoon, everybody. We'll get started here. Welcome to our webinar for this afternoon, Getting the Goods Without the Bads, Freight TDM Strategies to Reduce Urban Impacts. My name is Bill Holloway, and my co-author on the report that we'll be talking about here is also here. His name is Chris Spahr. He also works here at the State Smart Transportation Initiative. And we've got also with us Thomas Murtha from the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning, otherwise known as CMAP, who's going to be talking a little bit about some of the challenges that the Chicago area is facing with the freight movement and what some of the activities that they're doing to help smooth the flow of freight and reduce impacts on the community. And before we get into this, I just want to let you know a little bit about how we'll be handling questions and so forth. For your questions, we're going to be taking those through the question box that you'll see on the right side of your screen. And you should see a little area where you can type questions in. If you don't see the question area, you'll see a little tiny orange box in the upper right with a little white arrow in it. And if you click that, then it'll display the display a little area with the question area and so forth. And we'll be taking those questions at the end of the presentation. You can type them in whenever they occur to you, and at the end, then we'll be handling those in the order in which they were submitted. So we'll get started now. Let's see here. So the problem that led us to this report, few main problems, primarily the increasing urban highway congestion and congestion on major roads. As many of you know, the costs for road maintenance and construction have continued to increase faster than the pace of inflation, and particularly in built-up urban areas, it's prohibitively expensive oftentimes to expand roads and highways. On top of that, even if we could expand all of our roads and highways as much as we wanted, the social costs to that would really be prohibitive. And so by social costs, we're talking about negative externalities, things like emissions, noise, safety, road damage that's not totally paid for by the industry, congestion-related delay facing other travelers and so forth, and just livability concerns from noise and so forth that residents might have to deal with. And so we were looking in this report at ways that we can reduce these costs, and we started by looking at what are the costs of transporting freight by highway and railroad in urban areas, and how are all of these costs allocated to shippers, taxpayers, and society at large. Second, how can the social costs of goods movement in urban areas be most effectively reduced through freight transportation demand management activities? This term of freight transportation demand management, or freight TDM, as you'll hear it discussed in our presentation here, is parallel to the TDM measures that have been implemented for passengers, commuters, and so forth, trying to get people to, say, travel at different times of day or use an alternate mode, telecommute, whatever. Many of these same types of strategies can be applied to the freight industry. So for our report that has led up to this webinar, we first reviewed literature to estimate and allocate the costs associated with truck and rail transportation. We identified the TDM strategies being used in urban areas. And then we looked at we got a little bit further into what some of these urban areas are doing and developed case studies that you can find in our report, looking at Chicago, Philadelphia, Kansas City, New York City, Orlando, and Portland, and then, of course, prepared the final report. We'll be hearing from Tom Murtha from the Chicago area later on in this presentation. Among the costs, the primary costs you're looking at when you're evaluating these for trucking and railroad, you've got public infrastructure costs, so pavement preservation. Obviously, because trucks are operating in on public infrastructure, and railroads are generally operating on privately owned track, the cost of maintaining the roads is being paid for by taxpayers, and trucks do pay some taxes in to help pay for the roads. Railroads, though, are generally completely self-sufficient. We got emissions of particulate matter and nitrogen oxide. These are some of the big, one of the bigger social costs of both of these modes. Accidents. Obviously, trucks tend to be involved in more accidents because they're operating in the midst of cars, bikes, and other traffic, although you do get lots of crashes at railroads, at grade crossings, and so forth. Then, of course, the contribution to road congestion is much greater for trucks than railroads. At the bottom of this, you can see that overall, there's, as estimated by the Government Accountability Office, trucking imposes significantly greater social costs on society than railroads. And the strategies that we looked at through the course of our report include anti-idling rules that have been implemented by cities, states, and counties, designation of truck routes, promoting a shift from truck to rail, changing pickup and delivery times, ITS solutions such as mobile apps and dynamic messaging signs, land use strategies, adjusting parking policies, and planning information strategies. We'll go into a little bit more depth here about what each of these are, and so I'm going to hand it off to my colleague Chris to talk about the anti-idling rules.
Thanks, Bill. So through our research, we found that truckers without auxiliary power units, or APUs, spend an average of roughly 1,800 hours a year idling their engines, which generates carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, nitrogen oxide, and particulate matter. And due to this and some other goals of reducing noise and so forth, we found that over 110 states, counties, and municipalities have restrictions against idling vehicles. Amongst these different entities, the goals, the vehicles covered, the idling time limits, the enforcement, the exemptions, and the penalties all vary widely. In general, we saw that time limits were most often between 1 and 15 minutes of allowed idling time. Again, the goals were normally to reduce noise or emissions. There were exemptions oftentimes for extreme weather or operation of certain equipment in the truck, such as lifts and those types of things to load and unload. And also the vehicle operator, the vehicle owner, and or the property owner may be held responsible. And we found that in terms of implementation, really education, consistent enforcement, and sufficiently high penalties were the most important things to affect changes in vehicle operator behavior. Another TDM strategy that is the most common of all of them is designating truck routes. And again, this is one of the most common ways that cities can manage freight transportation demand management. It allows cities and metropolitan areas to target infrastructure improvements where the trucks are traveling, to reduce the exposure of residents to emissions, and to separate the truck traffic from the bicyclists and pedestrians. And the various strategies for designating truck routes can include your standard truck route network. We found that in downtown Orlando, there's a great truck route designation system that's highlighted in our report. And in Orlando, by restricting trucks to specific routes, the city can more efficiently meet the needs of all the modes of transportation. In terms of turn restrictions, New York City has a great through streets program which restricts vehicles from turning off of certain streets in the Midtown area, which creates more efficient movements of traffic. It also encourages trucks traveling cross town to use these through streets and takes them off of some of the other heavily trafficked streets in Midtown Manhattan. And also the arterials only, we found that Phoenix, Arizona is a good example that they classify their entire arterial street network as truck routes, and trucks are only traveling on the local streets for deliveries and pickups, otherwise they got to stick to the arterial roads. And in terms of implementation of truck routes, we found that implementing truck routes it's really important before implementing the truck route designations to study the current trends in truck movement and to identify the routes that with appropriate road geometries within the city and to ensure efficient connectivity in all the downtown areas. And another TDM strategy that we looked at was the mode shift from truck to rail. This was a really interesting one because you would think right off the bat incentivizing a shift from truck to rail seems like a really great idea. But we just ran into so many challenges through our research that one of those is that there's often intense resistance from residents who live in close proximity to railroad lines that will carry the additional freight. This is due to some of the extra noise, and a lot of these freight trains, when they're crossing the road, there's no grade separation, and so it causes a lot of traffic congestion. So again, this creates a lot of intense resistance. Another major thing that we found that for freight traveling through cities, truck-to-rail modal shift may create more problems than it actually solves when applied to shipments originating or terminating in cities, because trucks are ultimately needed to bridge that last mile. In addition, at freight rail hubs, containers are often moved by truck between rail terminals before they continue on to their destinations by rail. We'll probably hear a little bit more about this later, but because in Chicago and many other freight-heavy cities, the more rail freight oftentimes begets more truck freight. Another TDM strategy that we found effective is adjusting delivery hours. And there's two ways to do this that conflict with each other oftentimes. The first way is the off-peak delivery, which reduces the amount of congestion associated with truck traffic and truck loading and unloading during peak travel times. And we found that trucking companies already prefer to avoid the peak period, but the pickup and delivery schedules are often driven by the needs of the businesses and the individuals that are shipping and receiving these goods. For this reason, working with commercial retailers to promote off-peak deliveries is important to be effective in allowing for off-peak delivery. And a good example of that is New York City did a pilot program where they worked with Midtown retailers to accept off-peak deliveries on the receiving end. And also on pickup locations, there's an example with the Pier Pass program at the Twin Ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach, where under this program, all the international container terminals have weekday and weekend off-peak periods and a traffic mitigation fee, which is assessed on all containers picked up at the terminals during on-peak times. So, and then the other policy that we found is the nighttime delivery bans, which are oftentimes implemented to reduce nighttime noise in residential areas. These policies, however, often add to existing daytime congestion and contribute to a regulatory, sort of a regulatory patchwork that is difficult for carriers to navigate and oftentimes creates unintended consequences and inefficiency elsewhere on the network. So rather than implementing nighttime restrictions on identifying and enforcing a network of truck routes that avoids residential areas is a less heavy-handed option in that case. And for cities and regions that are interested in shifting more freight to off-peak hours, working with the industry to develop an incentive-based system for voluntary off-peak pickup and delivery can achieve significant benefits without generating too much opposition from carriers or incurring large enforcement costs. Now I'm going to ask Bill to cover some of the other transportation demand management strategies that we researched for this report.
All right, thanks, Chris. So ITS, or Intelligent Transportation Systems, is another promising area for urban freight TDM. And just a little refresher, so FHWA defines intelligent transportation systems as electronics, communications, or information processing used singly or in combination to improve the efficiency or safety of a surface transportation system. So this is clearly a pretty wide category. Here in our picture here, we've got sort of a slightly old version of a dynamic messaging sign. Most now have a lot more flexibility. But we've also got things like real-time GPS guidance, similar to the Garmin things that I'm sure many of you have in your cars. Dynamic traffic management, this could be anything from adjusting traffic signals or highway ramp meters, other ways to control the flow of traffic. And then these last two, computerized scheduling and shipment information and load matching systems, these would be to more efficiently, like a load matching system, for example, would connect a truck that is just, say, dropped off a load at a warehouse or a rail yard with other available loads. Computerized scheduling systems, these help to ensure that you don't get a big queue of trucks all waiting outside the port or the rail yard to pick up their goods. Instead, they can find out when the goods are going to be there and arrive on time to pick them up. You reduce queuing on city streets and help ensure a smoother flow of goods around these transfer facilities. And both of these bottom ones were used during the Crosstown Improvement Project, which is known as CTIP. That was a pilot program in the Kansas City area, which did show these were promising, but I think these will probably be handled by the private sector more in the future. Land use strategies, a lot of cities are trying to hold on to their freight and industrial uses inside the city. So Orlando has gotten a good bit of press for their freight village concept, sort of clustering freight near transportation facilities. And industrial zoning overlay districts. An overlay district is a zoning classification that's just dropped on top of the existing zoning. And in the city of Baltimore, their maritime industrial zoning overlay district is a good example of this. It only affects those parcels that have access to either a deep water berth or I believe rail facility is also included there. So that can maintain those uses in downtown areas where you might have heavy pressure to redevelop them into mixed-use offices or condos. But something like a deep water berth or the rail connectivity there, that it's important to preserve those because you're unlikely to get them back. They may be prohibitively expensive to build once it's no longer being used for that industrial purpose. Parking, obviously cities have been dealing with parking codes and so forth since we've had vehicles. And one of the key thing, I think, that we've found during our report is just to make sure that you have space for trucks that are unloading their goods in downtown areas. If these spaces are if people are parking in these spaces illegally, and it's car parking and not truck parking, or the time limits aren't being enforced, then you're going to end up getting trucks driving around looking for parking, and that just creates a lot more vehicle miles traveled. It's clogging up the traffic stream and creating more emissions and higher costs and so forth. And really, even if you're charging for parking, a lot of the time the carriers like these don't mind that at all because it enables them to get in, drop their goods, and move on to the rest of their business without wasting their time. So those can be a win-win solution. And planning information strategies. This we gave this title to these sort of the basic informational building blocks of planning decisions. Here we can see the Philly Freight Finder that's put together by the DVRPC, that's the Delaware Valley Regional Planning Commission that operates in the Philadelphia area. And so they have put together this website, and it shows all the freight facilities, key highways, rail yards, railroads, ports, and so on and so forth, and gets it all together, not only in the city of Philadelphia, but also in the surrounding areas. And I think these sort of things, where you collect the information and put it all in one easy-to-use place, this can really help out when you're planning later on, so you can get the lay of the land with freight, because sometimes it's hard to know where all of this stuff is if you don't have the information gathered together. So now I'm going to hand it over here to Tom Murtha, our guest from CMAP in Chicago. He's going to talk a little bit about the challenges Chicago is facing and how they're using some of these freight TDM strategies to help sort out their issues. Tom, are you there?
Yeah, I am. Thanks, Bill.
Yep.
So talk a little bit about Chicago. Our region is a substantial freight hub in the middle of the country. We have container volumes that are, as measured by TEUs, are among the top 10 in the world. As a result of all of the rail activity that we have in the region, we do have some rail congestion. So moving freight from truck to rail not only has negative impacts on the level of rail congestion here in Chicago, because many of the rails meet for interchanges here and container terminals. A lot of the rail congestion that we have is being addressed by capital improvements. Now, the focus of the study isn't on capital improvements, but for the rail system, that's a fairly big part of what we're doing with what's called the CREATE program, separating some conflicting movements and adding more resiliency to the system, more options to get around, that sort of thing. So, but the other part of that is that the rail activity, especially through the containers, contributes substantially to the truck congestion within the city of Chicago and the region overall. We have trucks moving containers from terminal to terminal, and we also have trucks moving containers from the terminals to and from their destinations or origins within a few hundred miles of Chicago. So a lot of the trucks are serving basically a large part of the Midwest here. So in addition to all of the freight travel, we have 8.5 million people with commerce and so forth that generates quite a bit of truck trips, and as well as all of the passenger vehicle trips. So a big congestion issue here in Chicago. Through, I guess, the other kind of adding complexity to that is the fact that to deal with some of the externalities and the highway issues and the congestion that we've talked about, we have more than 250 local communities, 7 counties, and several other jurisdictions that are setting regulations and policies with regard to freight activity within their jurisdiction and on their jurisdiction roads. So next slide. And I want to kind of go through some consequences of how these kind of conflicting regulations and policies actually play out. So a few types of restrictions that we talk about. There are parking restrictions and the lack of parking in appropriate places close to the destinations, where it might be kind of a quick trip from from a parking place to the delivery time. Actual delivery time restrictions we talked about a little bit. A lot of communities have set restrictions where all or part of the city is closed off to delivery during off-peak hours, moving the trucks to the peak period. We have truck route restrictions, basically restricting where trucks can go, and the restrictions may be basically blanket restrictions that some communities have put in. There may be weight restrictions, and there may be axle load restrictions that are placed on these. Likewise, we have physical restrictions with regard to height on some of our older rail viaducts and bridge postings. There are a lot of old bridges within the region that may have postings on them, weight limits, and so forth. So when you look at this example that we have on our screen here, the truck is beginning a trip at 6 a.m. and reaching a destination by 7 a.m. They can't park near the delivery location because of the lack of secure parking at the location. They may have to pay tolls on higher tolls on the roads that we actually want to encourage them to travel on. They may face congestion in the area, and then as they get closer to the destination, near 7 a.m. or 8 a.m., then we find that the truck is actually conflicting with some of the community needs to move kids to school, crossing these roads often. So there's maybe a delivery restriction on the end, prohibiting anything delivered before 7 a.m. So again, all of these ordinances and problems kind of quickly lead to some of these consequences that we don't want. So next slide. So we had a plan development process that went along with our Go to 2040 Regional Comprehensive Plan that did some initial identification of some of these issues and laid out some policy recommendations for adoption in the Go to 2040 plan. A lot of those recommendations were actually included in our regional comprehensive plan, and we are now in the process of plan implementation. So part of this is actually developing kind of a blue ribbon committee, what we're calling the Regional Freight Leadership Task Force, comprising high-level elected officials and corporate leaders in the region to kind of work through some of these conflicts and issues. We're also developing databases of the restrictions that we've got and the both the physical restrictions and the policy restrictions we have on our roads. And using this database in concert with our highway network for regional travel demand modeling, we're also setting this up so that as we look toward kind of recommendations for the Freight Leadership Task Force, we can do some scenario testing. What if we change these restrictions or kind of had some different options? The goal here is to be able to do some of that scenario testing. So it's taken a lot of research, a lot of hours to actually go through and work through some of this data collection and so forth. But again, we're to the point where the information is actually being useful and actually being employed by some of our agencies. We are in the midst of a truck route study that's being led by the City of Chicago. We have 12 regional councils and plus 11 regional councils plus a city that work on sub-regional issues within our larger region. The city has been granted planning funds by CMAP to undertake this truck route study, and we'll see how that goes. We are anticipating a series of recommendations this week for consideration by our planning group, and then that can be recommended for adoption by the City of Chicago. And public outreach and stakeholder coordination. I mean, a lot of this stuff is pretty, you know, when a local community really sits down and works on their policies, they need to understand the broader picture, and part of what we're trying to do is raise awareness of all that. So those are some of the some of the things that we're trying to do here in the Chicago region to work through some of these issues, getting the goods without the bads. Let's see. So I'll turn it back over to Bill.
That's great. Thanks a lot, Tom. I'm going to pass it on here to Chris to wrap us up here. So just to summarize some of our findings in the report, again, through researching the literature and talking with the implementers, we've identified which TDM strategies seem to be the most effective at reducing social costs in metropolitan areas. And this table is a summary, a visual summary of these strategies that seem to be most effective. And I'm not going to go through each and every detail of it, but just a few examples. You know, the parking policies, for example, they offer many beneficial impacts to congestion, health, safety, noise, livability, the shipper and receiver costs, as well as the carrier costs. So across the board, there's a lot of positives with parking policies. Additionally, if you look at the right column where it says difficulty to implement, we tried to assess, you know, how difficult are these to implement, and parking policies seems to be an easy one to implement. Another example would be planning information strategies, which Bill defined for us as preserving existing freight land uses and where they're located. This is also very beneficial and fairly easy to implement. And then another example, looking at land use strategies, while they're effective across the board, working with the diverse stakeholders and implementing new zoning to ensure the existence of conveniently located freight centers can be a bit more challenging, so that it received a medium to high difficulty to implement. And really the goal of this is for a quick go-to resource that, you know, decision makers can go to try to find some of the low-hanging fruit in their communities, some things that are less expensive to implement and sometimes more easily implementable. So, and finally, we come to just some general conclusions here. Through, you know, our 9 months of research on this, we found that freight TDM strategies do have a potential to create efficiency for businesses, as well as to reduce some of the social costs associated with urban freight transportation. We did find that 2 of these strategies could create more problems than they resolve, and one of those is the restrictions on nighttime freight delivery are likely to exacerbate some of the regional congestion and increase the transportation costs as well. The efforts to effect the modal shift from truck to rail could face some strong community opposition and could end up generating more truck trips than they eliminate. And finally, we're going to wrap up this presentation and go to questions. So if you have any questions, we've gotten some in the box so thus far. If you have any more, please feel free to add them. We'll try to go through and answer all of them. And if you think of a question after the presentation, feel free to contact either of the authors on this report. Our email addresses are listed there on this slide. And also you can find the report at the SSTI website. That's www.ssti.us. This presentation will be recorded and will be available on the SSTI website later this afternoon. So now I'm going to pull down the question box and go through a few of these questions. We have a question here. How did we come up with the criteria air pollutant emissions amounts that we used in our uncompensated cost calculations?
I think we basically were relying on previously published studies for this. So we looked at certainly the Government Accountability Office report that we displayed the table from that, and other reports you can see referenced in the document on the SSTI website. So we basically were just going with previously published work in short for that.
And there was also a comment about this is related to the cost as well, that why don't we have any congestion costs listed for freight rail, being that we all know that freight trains do sometimes cause passenger delays or do sometimes delay passenger trains, and also sometimes they block roads. We even mentioned the grade crossings in this report, and that's a really great point. The table that we have listed in this presentation is from the Government Accountability Office, and one of the challenges with getting data on freight rail is that it's very difficult to come by. And I think while we ourselves were not contacting freight companies to get this data, we were using secondary sources. A lot of them had trouble really monetizing that. However, there are some other tables that we included in our report but did not include in this presentation, and maybe we should have included some of that data. But I think some of and it does, so those other tables do talk about some of the congestion costs related to freight rail. However, I did want to mention too that the point that we really wanted to make, at least in this presentation, is that from what we've been reading, we have found that the costs associated with trucking is significantly higher than that. The cost passed on to consumers, or not passed on to consumers, I apologize, is significantly higher with trucking than it is with rail.
All right. Okay, and we had another question on why these strategies are classified as demand management and reducing demand not for cargo but for deliveries by mode and number of trips. So one second, we're getting a little feedback. The primary reason we're calling these demand management is we saw the parallels with passenger and commuter transportation that are normally used, and it's also because we're not trying to reduce the total volume of goods that are moving around. The goal is to get them to move in a way that's going to be more efficient and reduce the costs both for the shippers but also for the people living in cities, and reduce road maintenance costs and expansion costs and so forth. So that was our rationale for that.
There's a question here, or a comment about appreciating a list of speakers and bios.
So we can we can put a list of bios up on our website that you can get. And we also have a couple of other questions about the slides and so forth. So if you visit the SSTI website, that's ssti.us, you can find a copy of our report. We'll throw up a list of the speakers and bios, and you can also get a recorded copy of this webinar. You can point someone else to it, and that should be all up on the SSTI website later this afternoon. So if anybody else has any other, does anybody have any other questions? Feel free to send them in. And let's see, any other?
I think we did have one more here that we might not have answered. So the impacts of modal shift are highly dependent on the local conditions. Based on the case study surveyed, what variables suggest a benefit and what variables suggest no or adverse impacts?
So this is kind of a tricky one. Obviously, it's very dependent on the local scenario, the local situation. If you've got a lot of what they term in the industry, I think, rubber tire transfers, or I think that's it, basically transferred from one rail yard to another that are being made with a truck, obviously that's going to, and you have more rail traffic, and then you get more of those transfers between rail terminals via truck. That's an adverse impact from this. I think the graphic that we showed, I'm actually just kind of pop back to this because I think this is a really very interesting case here. In Barrington, this is where CN, that's Canadian National, has acquired the Elgin, Joliet, and Eastern rail line, which had been a relatively low-volume freight line around the Chicago area. And they've been increasing the number of freight trains on that line. But the residents along that line have been really up in arms about this, and Barrington has I believe, filed some legal action with the Surface Transportation Board. They want assistance paying for grade separation because both for traffic congestion issues related to blocked at-grade crossings, but also for emergency response. And this is one of the other very big issues with train traffic, is that if the ambulances and the police cars can't reach people in need, that's a real problem. So those are just a couple of the issues that you have sometimes with modal shift.
Yeah, we have another question.
Can I add something?
Oh, sure. Go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, one thing that people need to differentiate is the difference between like carload freight and container freight. The growth in rail traffic recently has largely been in container traffic, and railroads really aren't growing the carload industry as fast as they used to. It is true that if traffic can be moved to carload, basically moving it from the dock of a business to the dock of another business, or that sort of thing, then that is pretty much a lower cost, lower congestion cost move than say a container would be, but it's a lot more difficult for the railroads to deal with. So there are costs and benefits on either end there.
Right. Good point, Tom. And it seems like if you're going to do what you're describing, where these direct rail moves, then you'll need railroad spurs, which I think some cities and states have been providing some financial assistance or incentives for the construction or the maintenance of those rail spurs. Is the Chicago area doing anything like that to promote, to increase the amount of that freight that's just moving only by rail?
It's a difficult sell here. I mean, the particular problem that Chicago has is we're a national hub, so the railroads prioritize national moves. So in fact, we are still losing a lot of our spurs and some of the non-mainline road tracks that we've had in the region, and that historically really was part of the industrial heart of Chicago. So. So it's really difficult here. It may not be so difficult in other communities that have better access to kind of non-mainline rail track.
Yeah, interesting. I think we've got a few more questions coming in. Chris?
Sure, we have one here. It says, where has the freight TDM model you are using been developed and by whom, and is it commercially available? I can't say exactly the source of where it was developed. However, if you just get online and start searching for this, or if you take a look at our report and look at some of the sources we cited, there's loads of information out there about the idea behind freight TDM, and it is relatively new, and there's some really innovative things that cities are taking up to try to deal with this. And in fact, it probably originated from the needs expressed within metropolitan areas and researchers trying to come up with some of those solutions.
Yeah, and one thing about this too is a lot of these strategies aren't branded as freight TDM, and so that makes it a little bit more complicated, and they're not often thought of as a basket of related strategies.
Yeah, and even in the introduction to our report, we talk about how it is relatively new and it hasn't been talked about enough, and so that's what we're trying to do, as with all research, just trying to get people thinking and also getting metropolitan areas to try to share ideas and come up with some solutions to challenging and problems with a lot of different moving parts. So we have another question. Actually, Tom, you could probably field this one. It says, would Tom detail who is on the Regional Freight Leadership Task Force and how the call for members was issued and who selected those members? Tom, are you available to answer that?
Yeah, I am, and I am actually, if you'll give me just 1 second, I am going to call this up.
So while Tom's looking that up, there is another question here that says, we've had a hard time restricting through trucks to designated routes unless there is a physical reason, for example, weight limited bridge, low clearance, special needs populations such as hospitals or schools. Otherwise, trucking firms cite constitutional rights to travel upon any public road. How did your study jurisdictions restrict truck movements?
So I'm sure that there's going to be pushback when a community that doesn't have truck routes decides to implement them. On the other hand, this is remarkably common, and I think if you have neighborhood groups that are citing noise or pollution or safety concerns, that's usually, if you've got a strong movement pushing for that, then I think that you should be able to do it. I mean, certainly it could be a political problem, but a lot of places do this, and there's a lot of different reasons. And when we talk about truck routes and routes that trucks can or can't use, all of basically the way that cities do it is they say trucks can use any of these truck routes. You can drive on the route as much as you want, but if you're making a delivery or pickup that's not on a truck route, then you have to use the truck route network to get you as close as you can before you operate off of the network. So you're not really limiting their truck's ability to reach any address. You're just saying you have to go as much of the route as possible, staying on the truck route network. And I bet Tom Murtha might have a little bit more to contribute to this. Tom, do you know? Yeah, can you speak?
Yeah, so it really depends on the community. Some roads simply have fairly drastic restrictions. Other roads have less restrictions, and it depends on the municipality. Really, there are state guidelines that kind of govern what the local community can do, but those guidelines in fact end up being broad, except for some things like moving vans you can't restrict. Mm-hmm. But other types of heavy trucks and so forth, if there is a reason for the local community to put the restriction on, then they can. The other part of it is that there has to be reasonable access within a mile of an interstate highway interchange. Mm-hmm. So local community restrictions. You can put in local community restrictions in within that mile, but they need to be posted and adopted by ordinance within that mile. Some communities put on blanket restrictions and then say you have to use the truck routes. Other communities say they put in restrictions just on some roads, and other roads are permitted for truck routes. It depends on how the roads were constructed and lots of other factors like that. Mm-hmm. So, and the real problem, one of the problems that we have in adopting those restrictions is getting communities to consider the restrictions of their neighbor communities. So we have some truck routes that go to a municipal border. Yeah, you can have an 80,000-pound truck. Go to the border, you turn right, there's a no truck sign. You go straight, there's a no truck sign. You turn left, there's a no truck sign. Doesn't work. So that's part of the reason why we're kind of concentrating on these things, just so we have better information for truckers, and we have coordination between some of the local communities. We think that if we can rationalize the truck route system, the overall miles that trucks have to travel may fall, and the congestion impact that they have may also fall. So that's the idea there. I have the list of the task force, mm-hmm. the Freight Leadership Task Force, if we want to go back to that question.
Yeah, excellent. You want to read that question again?
Sure, just one more time to read the question. Would Tom detail who was on the Regional Freight Leadership Task Force, how the call for members was issued, and who selected the members?
Okay, so the members include, and I'm not going to name the individuals, but I'll kind of go over the company and so forth. A representative of the University of Chicago, Harris School of Public Policy, president of one of our villages, president of a trucking firm, vice president of another trucking firm, Chief Innovation Officer for a logistics firm, representative of the RTA, president of a large logistics property development, warehousing and logistics property development company, county transportation planner, a senior staff for the Chicago Department of Transportation, a vice president of a public policy interest group, Metropolis Strategies, assistant vice president for a railway, regional operations manager for FedEx, manager for another railway, and a superintendent of a county highway department. So those are the sorts of people that we had, and the membership was approved by, discussed with, and approved by our board as the concept for development of this was developed, or was discussed and kind of had some outreach with different stakeholders about who needed to be involved. Folks like the trucking industry and the rail industry and so forth, local governments, groups with key interests in the work that we're doing here.
Great. Well, thanks, Tom. It looks like we've covered all of our questions here. Tom, thanks so much for joining us on this, and thanks to all of our guests here. As we mentioned, we'll have a recording of this presentation on the SSTI website. You can also find the document there as well. And yeah, so thanks everybody, and thank you, Tom. And
okay,
we'll see you all at the next SSTI webinar. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.